So today's meeting, the botanical history of gin and tonic. So Kim Walker and Professor Mark Nesbitt are Kew botanists, and they are authors of Just the Tonic, a natural history of tonic water, published by Kew Publishing, and that is going to be on sale in our library after the meeting. So Mark Nesbitt, as I've said, he's a fellow of the Linnean Society. He's been a fellow for over 25 years. And he's currently curator of the Economic Botany collection at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. And his research centres on botany and empire in the 19th century and on the history and current day management of botanical collections. Kim Walker, she trained as a medical herbalist, and she now specialises in the history of plant medicines. And she's currently working on a PhD on cinchona at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, together with Royal Holloway, University of London. So in this richly illustrated talk, Kim and Mark are going to cut through centuries of legends to reveal a history of botany, medicine, empire, and drinking, to discover how the tree came together with the alcohol and soda to create the perfect gin and tonic. So I'll hand over first to Mark. Thanks.
So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Leanne and the Linnean Society for the special arrangements for this evening of the talk followed by the drinks and opportunities to really small but really rich and fascinating exhibition of the cinchona artifacts in the Linnean Society's collections. So why did we write this book? Well, it's really prompted by Kew Publishing, who are represented in the audience somewhere. Can you wave your hands? Yes, at the back. Gina and Lydia, who are very astute at spotting gaps in the market. And they noticed it on the back of a sort of gin revolution that Kim will talk about later. But there are loads and loads of books. There's probably about half of these sort of current in-print books on gin that you'll find across the road in Hatchards. And gin, of course, is a really important botanical story involving juniper. It's important in British history. And yet there's really no books at all about tonic except for a little e-book, small but rather fascinating, you can only get on Kindle, from Camper English, one of the great gurus of mixology in the United States. And it's quite interesting tracking our respective approaches or important points where we agree and disagree on the history of a gin and tonic. And so we've tried to fill this gap, and tonic is an important gap because it's the source, the basis of a very British drink, universally recognised as originating in sort of British culture. It's got a remarkable global history in it of quinine, the tree it comes from, cinchona, malaria, and the mosquitoes that spread malaria. And also the fascinating social history of the as a soft drink itself in its own right, and in the various cocktails with which it's mixed. And we had a further motivation in writing the book. But cinchona, quinine, and the gin and tonic have all attracted this very rich aura of legend that you referred to. I mean, the origin of tonic water itself, a core ingredient, placed anywhere from 1825 to 1858. The first mixing of a gin and tonic, we're completely uncertain, but everyone agrees in these books that it was developed as an anti-malarial drink. The arrival of a gin and tonic in Britain has been dated at any point from the 1870s to 1947 and the end of empire. So there's clearly much for us to investigate. So tonight, to keep this on a manageable level, if you want the full story, you have to read the book. We're going to concentrate on the botanical side and look at how medicine was transformed into one of the world's most important drinks. and a drink you can taste upstairs in the library afterwards. And as we're at the Linnean Society of his wonderful collections, we've also drawn on those for one or two slides. So we're not going to talk very much about malaria, but it's really important to recognize that still one of the world's really big killers. And I think one of the things that I like about, particularly about the gin and tonic story, is a number of gin and tonic companies donate part of our royalties to fighting malaria. Seems a really good thing to do. Now, it's a really, as we realized when we started to write the book, it's a really big and complicated story. And in a way, it would have been easier to write a 200,000 word book rather than a 20,000 word book, because there's a lot of distillation, and we had a lot of help in doing that distillation. So many people who've had a hand in all of this. Carla Monaldo, who did her PhD University of Copenhagen, the Natural History Museum is based at the National Herbarium in Bolivia, is perhaps the leading expert in actually living cinchona trees at the moment. Kim, working with students from Royal Holloway on digitizing our 1,000 cinchona barks. Natalie Canales. Natalie, you're in the room somewhere. Has she arrived yet? Or is she still on her way? But she will be here. From Peru, based again at the Natural History Museum in Copenhagen, who's working the ancient DNA and chemistry within our 1,000 bark specimens. Oscar Perez, who's working in contemporary genomics, together with Alex Antonelli, the head of science at Kew, just there, and Nina Ronstedt, also somewhere in the picture, who's now in Hawaii, but was in Copenhagen. So just somehow, in the last decade or so, a real research group has come together of botanists in Latin America, in Sweden and in Denmark, and at Kew, where a lot of effort is being applied to understanding cinchona. And we'll talk a little bit about reasons why that is such an important tree genus to be interested in. So let's start with quinine. So that's the chemical that's at the heart of the story, of our story. And it's the defining ingredient. It's what makes tonic water tonic. Any tonic water, no matter how cheap it is, you look at the ingredients, it's got quinine, and that quinine comes from cinchona bark. Alongside water, a sweetener, and citric acid. And it's the quinine that gives that distinctive astringent, perhaps some people find even bitter flavor, in concentrations of up to 83 milligrams per liter. And as the ene ending, quinine indicates it's an alkaloid like caffeine and morphine. And why is quinine and other alkaloids, why are they in plants? These are what phytochemists call, hi, come on in, Natalie. We've just been talking about your exciting work. Come and find a seat. There's some up at the front. We know each other very well. And quinine is what phytochemists call secondary plant compounds. It's not one of the fundamental chemicals that keeps the plant going, enables things like photosynthesis, it's very poisonous. And as Kim will talk a little bit about, if you consume too much tonic water, you can get into trouble. And it's quite surprising. It really took botanists till the 1960s to understand why do plants contain secondary plant compounds. It was suggested they were waste products from the sort of main photosynthetic processes. And of course, it was then realized, I think we now well understand this, that those secondary plant compounds are in there to protect the plant from predators. And so it's not surprising to find that quinine is actually concentrated in the bark of a cinchona tree here. Because the bark is your outer layer of protection against predators. It protects the plant in two ways. One, by being very bitter, that bitterness is so characteristic of alkaloids, and the other by then poisoning you if you actually insist on eating the plant. So a deterrent as well as a poison. And in fact, until the extraction of quinine was perfected as a pure alkaloid, the kind of form you get in the tablets, in Paris, exactly 200 years ago this year, it was mainly consumed in the form of powdered bark. And one of the tonic waters, so the first one I got for you to try afterwards, is when I wrote in my notes looking at this, I wrote a rusty brown colour. The manufacturers say amber, and this is made with raw cinchona powder, so really replicating what our ancestors might have been drinking in slightly different forms 200 years ago. But today it's more often used in forms like quinine sulfate, which are very measurable and dissolve easily in water. So the cinchona tree, where quinine comes from, where does it grow? It grows in these wonderful cloud forests that Natalie knows well, in a long stretch of the eastern slopes of the Andes, going all the way down, about 2,000 miles or so, in all, where the red dots are. And this cloud forest is high altitudes of 1,500 to 3,500 meters, incredibly biodiverse areas. This is where you find things like the spectacled bear, where Paddington comes from. Hugely important for biodiversity and for culture and livelihoods as well. And there are about 25 species of cinchona. They all have these lovely flowers, lilac-scented. I don't know if any of you have ever been into Trumper's Barbers down on Jermyn Street. It's the one place left where you can still get quinine-scented cologne, and it is a really marvellous and attractive scent. But if you poke around on eBay, you can find a lot of historical material about quinine scents. So those scents are not scented with the quinine itself. It's with the scent from the flower. We have this growing in the temperate house at Kew, and when it was last flowering a few months ago this summer, absolutely stunning and gorgeous scent. Now, cinchona has always been a problematic group for botanists. Those 25 species all look very similar to each other. In fact, leaf characteristics are often the best way to separate them. And as soon as you take them out of the wild and into cultivation, as for example in plantations in British India, they start to hybridize with each other. And a really important part of Natalie's work using DNA is to track back a lot of these 19th century hybrids and 19th century specimens that we think are often misidentified, or maybe hiding lost or undiscovered species, track them using their DNA and track them back into their original habitats. Now, cinchona trees have always had a bit of a hard life in the last 200 or 300 years, very heavily harvested, as we'll hear, as a medicine, really from the mid-17th century onwards, about harvesting intensifying the 19th century as people discovered more and more the benefits of quinine as a treatment for malaria, and as empire led to increased consumption in tropical areas. And there are many accounts from Humboldt onwards, the great traveller, of over-harvesting, which historians of science sometimes suggest are more about Europeans claiming mismanagement by local harvesters as a way of appropriating the plant, as they did. But there are sufficient kind of cross-referenceable records of this over-harvesting suggest it was a real phenomenon, but accelerated in the Second World War when you couldn't get quinine from the Far East, so Americans started harvesting it again, and now accelerated again by deforestation for agricultural purposes. And I had to look at the red list rankings for cinchona. Mostly the half or so species have been classified as vulnerable, high risk of extinction. And when you look behind them, you find there's no data. So cinchona growing is fabulously inaccessible unless you live in that area. If you're coming through Europe, you've got a choice of two routes to get there. One through the Amazon, and then up the eastern slopes of the Andes, or the others go around and up the western slopes of the Andes, over the top and down again. So plant that's really under-collected in the past, under-collected now. But there's a really urgent need to bring together, and we're starting to think a little bit about this with our collaborators. It's time for a kind of conservation and use status report on these wild cinchona trees, because not only are they really important for local biodiversity and livelihoods, but of course this is where the genes are sitting, but will help the plantations out in places like Java and Congo, where these companies get their quinine from, when those plantations are affected by climate change. So just as we've seen with coffee, very nice work at Kew, although these may not be of immediate economic importance, in 20 years' time we may be desperately looking at these wild populations for genes for resistance to climate change. So it's really important we protect these populations. So a little bit about the early history of cinchona. Like the history of gin and tonic, it's really obscure. Now, there's a natural tendency to project the history of herbal medicines back into the past. It's a kind of justification used by herbalists and used by us that it must work because it has a long, long history. And one of the areas I'm interested in the history of medicinal plants is as soon as you start to look into detail, you find these are much more complex and much more interesting narratives, if less helpful to people who want to use that argument of antiquity equals actually works. And the case of cinchona is no exception. There are classic papers by Haggis in 1941, and in the Botanical Journal of the Linnean Society in 1949 by, I think, former South American ambassador in London, a critical review of the basic facts and the history of cinchona, but have had absolutely no impact on kind of popular histories of cinchona, but are hugely important in rewriting it. Now, the first definite reference that we have, I think everyone would agree on, is from 1633. There grows a tree that they call the fever tree. Its bark the colour of cinnamon, made into powder and given as a beverage, cures the fevers and the tertians. That's the recurring fevers. That's what allows you to identify as a treatment for malaria rather than generic fevers. It has produced miraculous results in Lima. There's about, within 10 years, in the 1640s, you start to get the first really big exports into Europe. Now, there's a couple of intriguing earlier references around about 1600 in books where the terminology could perhaps refer to cinchona, but really not very much before 1574, and certainly nothing in the very earliest codices that record indigenous use of plants in the region. And there are, in fact, a number of reasons to suspect that the history of cinchona might be quite late. It might not have a deep indigenous history. And one is, of course, that malaria was absent pretty much from South America before the European conquerors brought enslaved people into the continent, bringing malaria with them from West Africa. So there isn't, and cinchona is really only effective against malaria. That's its main medicinal property, as we now understand. So why would you use it if you didn't have malaria? But the other is that until the 19th century, until railways came and brought malaria up into the highlands, essentially you had malarial lowlands along the coast, and you had cinchona here being harvested high up at 2,000 meters or so. So you have a disjunct between the populations of the plant and the populations of the malaria. So we don't know. The answer may lie buried in the Spanish archives. But my suspicion is that cinchona is a relatively late discovery as a medicinal plant, somewhere around about 1550. That is not to devalue the role of local people. It was definitely not discovered by Jesuit monks wandering through these cloud forests. It would be discovered by local healers, pushing, testing, as we know that traditional healers do, highly experimental, tasting barks, see what's bitter. It's known bitter barks will, we now know, contain alkaloids, highly likely to be medicinal. A lot of the work that's going on now in history and the biological approaches, DNA and chemistry, is starting to uncover these lost histories of indigenous knowledge. So in the 1640s, cinchona starts to arrive in Europe in these fantastic animal skin containers, which this is one in the Science Museum. Sadly, we don't have one at Kew, so if you do find one in your attic or on eBay, we would love to know about it. And this is, of course, how this material would arrive, for example, in the 18th and 19th century into London docks. It's the kind of material that pharmacists and chemists had to deal with, completely disconnected, many thousands of miles away, with no nice herbarium specimen or photograph with it to show which tree it came from. Introduction to Europe, one of the many legends, is often ascribed to the Countess of Chinchon, the wife of the Viceroy of Peru, based in Lima, and that 1949 paper really demolishes that story. The diaries of the Viceroy survive, and they show that his wife didn't have malaria, that she didn't travel to Spain, she didn't distribute cinchona bark to the poor, and yet it's a really lingering kind of legend. What we do know is the role of Jesuit priests, and hence the name Jesuits' bark in the 17th and 18th century sources is really important in that introduction to Europe. And that created a problem for people in Britain. Two problems. One, something to do with Roman Catholics. Two, something to do with Spain and Europe. And this led to literally a really strong resistance to the use of cinchona for treating malaria. And ironically, it's believed that Oliver Cromwell may well have died from malaria owing to refusing to take cinchona bark as a treatment, which I cannot feel very sympathetic to him for. And it didn't really catch on in Britain until Robert Talbot, the author of this book, he developed the cure. He very wisely didn't tell people that it contained cinchona or Jesuit's bark, that it contained a number of foreign and effective ingredients. Developed a secret recipe after he successfully treated King Charles II in the 1670s. He was knighted, and after his death, a secret ingredient, cinchona, was revealed in this book, at which point it became very widely used. And Patrick Wallace, economic historian at London School of Economics, has been looking at a lot of customs records and estimates that, for example, in the 1750s, around about 100,000 large doses or 300,000 small doses of cinchona bark were imported each year for local use in the UK. That's a lot of doses. So it implies that actually cinchona bark, although it was difficult to get hold of, had a long journey, was expensive, was nonetheless very, very widely used. Coming now to the Linnean connection. So there are lots of connections in the society and cinchona. There's a crucially important herbarium of Linnaeus, this fantastic specimen, Cinchona officinalis, the name that Linnaeus usually gave to medicinal species. And this is the sent to him by Mutis from Bolivia.
Sorry.
That's all right. Remind me to hand over shortly to Kim. Sent from Bolivia to Linnaeus, and this is a specimen which he developed and based the name cinchona. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about why the Countess of Chinchon has two H's in her name and cinchona only has one. And then a second connection is through Irma Bork Lambert, a great friend of the society, extremely well connected, built up one of the really great 19th century herbaria. Like a lot of botanists, spent too much on his hobby, went spectacularly bankrupt. When he died, his collections were sold. And his cinchona collections, which included really important material from Spain, from Ruiz and Pavon, some of it illustrated here, ended up at Kew and are a significant component of Kim's PhD thesis. But as Lambert, you'll see, read a paper on cinchona to the Linnean Society, as did Richard Spruce, as did many other people. It was such an important, pretty much along with opium poppy, perhaps the top two medicinal plants in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, we're going to, why is the spelling different? It's bothered people for a long time, but cinchona, the Latin name of a genus, it has one H in the chona, whereas the Countess of Chinchon, Chinchon has two H's. We have made a mistake in the book that we will own up to. We quoted other people who say Linnaeus made a mistake. Now, Linnaeus didn't make many mistakes. We have discovered that, in fact, in letters that he received from people like Mutis and Bolivia, they're all perfectly happy. They knew perfectly well about the Countess of Chinchon, with that spelling, the two H's often mentioned, perfectly happy with the genus name with one H. We found some of the sources that Linnaeus may have used were Italian sources, such as this work by Beda in the 1680s, where he talks about the Count of cinchon with one H, because of course in Italian, CI is pronounced ch. So it's a perfectly correct Italian spelling for cinchon to simply have one H in it. So we would no longer say that Linnaeus made a mistake. In the era of third spellings and third languages, he chose one particular spelling. And that leads us to the question about pronunciations. This has caused a bit of a problem about pronunciation ever since. And I'm just going to ask you to look at that word, the second word there, silently say it to yourself in your head, as you might say it in everyday conversation. And we're going to do an experiment. And it's important to say there's no right answer in this experiment, because when I first started working on this part, I asked people in the herbarium at Kew, and I got different answers from everybody. So very curious to know, if you say this word in your head, how many of you would say it as A? Put your hand up. Okay. Are you by any chance from the continent of Europe? Because that is a rather continental pronunciation. B, cinchona. Okay, good. C, cinchona. D, cinchona. Ooh, okay, might have a winner there. I think B and D are leading so far. E, cinchona, which is used in the industry, I know, and F, cinchona. Ooh, okay, I would say joint perhaps in F, D, and B, with a fair scattering of E. That tells you there is, in fact, no correct pronunciation. So whatever Kim says, who I'm about to hand over to, will be the correct pronunciation for this evening. Kim, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So I say cinchona, but I often work with the other largest collection of cinchona in the world, with the Dutch, and they call it cinchona. So really, I take on the attitude of what Mark told me on my first day at Kew about 8 years ago, which is it doesn't matter as long as you say it with confidence. That's how people will just believe you. So I'm going to, and also can I just say, I still think Linnaeus should have spelt it with a CH, but you know, we'll agree to disagree. So I'm going to talk about a little tiny bit about malaria, because as Mark said, so many people were interested in cinchona and talking about it and collecting it, but why was it so significant for us? And that's because, particularly all those doses that were coming into Britain, we kind of think about malaria as something you might pick up in a tropical climes when we come back from holiday, or others might consider remembering about malaria around Rome and the marshy areas of Rome, where Horace Walpole coined the term malaria, meaning bad air. But actually, we did have malaria in Britain until fairly recently, and it's just slightly out of living memory, which is why I think many people don't realise that. On the right here, we have a diagram of deaths per 100,000 inhabitants from malaria, 1840 to 1910. And you can see on the east side there, around low-lying marshy areas of Kent, Essex and the Wash, you have significant amounts of people dying from malaria. The black areas are 96 to 115 deaths per 100,000. So it was something that was of great concern to people in Britain. On the left here, we have a cartoon of agues and fevers, which are showing the very characteristic symptoms of malaria, which is chills followed by fevers, called tertians, as Mark called before. So, why did malaria become eradicated? Well, around World War I, much work was done by the army. You can see a little troop of guys here with rakes and brooms draining ditches. Ditches where mosquitoes breed, and mosquitoes are the main, the spread malaria. Sorry, my shoelace is undone, and it's really annoying me. So getting rid of ditches and swamps, get rid of mosquitoes, and then you can reduce malaria. And later on, things like DDT also helped. So quinine, we know, is a cure for malaria, but it was a particularly significant finding in the mid-19th century that really changed the way that quinine and cinchona bark was used, and that was its use as a preventative. Though the Navy actually occasionally used cinchona bark preventatively, and you can find that sometimes throughout history in the 18th century, it wasn't taken up popularly, and particularly in the army, until the mid-19th century. And as British troops and other empires were going into areas like West Tropical Africa, there were really significant deaths for people going in. I've got some statistics here showing that British troops sent to Sierra Leone between 1819 and 1836 suffered an average of 483 deaths per 1,000 troops. And worse statistics abound. The Lander-led Niger expedition of 1832 lost 40 out of 49. Really significant deaths, and it really inhibited the expansion of various empires. But in 1854, William Balfour Beatty, who was a physician, went on an expedition and tried instead to give people quinine every day before they'd get malaria. All returned alive. And it's from this point that quinine was really in great demand by various empires and for military success. This picture here shows soldiers in North America taking daily doses of quinine and whiskey, actually. The North had better access to medicines. And the next picture is of Gurkhas being given daily doses of malaria as well. So I'm just going to go slightly back. 200 years ago this year, two French chemists, Pelletier and Caventou, isolated the active constituent, quinine, out of the cinchona bark and called it quinine. These are the two guys. This is some of their quinine. And it's from this point on that quinine could then be measured. This meant you could give effective dosages. You could give research trials rather than relying on various amounts of barks that might be more effective or less effective. And the other significant thing about quinine is it gave you a tool to measure your bark. There are 25 species, as Mark said. At the time, people thought there were many more than that, almost 100. But how did you understand which tree and which barks that you could collect to make drugs from, or perhaps which ones were going to be effective as a medicine? So it gave you a way to take your bark and measure the amount of quinine in it and see if it was an effective one for medicine. And also, if you want to grow the trees for yourself, you can target species that will be valuable for growing. At Kew Gardens, we have a really large collection of cinchona bark, and my PhD is on this collection, how it came to be. It was being used extensively by scientists in the 19th century Britain, trying to work out this connection between chemistry and botany, and which species were the most valuable potentially for cultivation. One gentleman in particular I'm focusing on is a guy called John Eliot Howard, who was born into a Quaker family of pharmaceutical manufacturers who provided drugs. And he was really a genius about quinine. He took up the question about quinine very early in 1827, and from the 1830s to the 1880s, did a lot of extensive research on barks coming in the animal skin serons, packages that Mark showed you before, and at drug trade docks. So his company was using a lot of that to produce quinine, but he was analysing it to see which one was valuable, and also from contacts in South America to understand the botany. And this is an example of one of the specimens that we have at Kew. On it you can see there's a little label handwritten by Howard himself. He had hundreds and hundreds of these specimens. On it he will have said what the date was, where he got it from, which species is assigning that bark to, and in the bottom corner you can just about see he's telling you how much of the different types of alkaloids appear in that bark. So we've got quinine, quinidine, cinchonine and cinchonidine, which are the four main quinine-like alkaloids, all of which are slightly anti-malarial. And a recent work by our team in Copenhagen, Natalie Canalis, who is here, and myself, sampled the barks, and Natalie has discovered that he was really accurate about his measurements. The methods that he was using was very accurate, and also that the quinine has stayed very stable in bark to this date. So Howard was bringing together the botany and the chemistry of the bark, and it was crucial in helping choose some of the trees that went over to plantations in the 19th century. So we have a slide a little bit about this transfer from South America to plantations in South and Southeast Asia. I can only talk about this briefly, but I'd like to recommend that you do read Mark Honigsbaum's book. He's here tonight. You can go speak to him. He had a book called The Fever Trail, which was given to me on my first day of a PhD, and really goes in depth in this story, and it's well worth a read. And also Fiammetta Rocco's Miraculous Fever Tree. I'm just going to pick up a couple of stories. about which trees ended up in plantations. So concerns over quality and sustainability of supply, as well as financial sense, because it would be cheaper to produce it for themselves. Various different empires sought to go get cinchona, particularly the British and the Dutch. Eventually, this gentleman here, Richard Spruce, collects cinchona pubescens from Ecuador and sent his seeds over to British Indian plantations, and those are the ones that set up the foundations for British plantations. But the most tragic story, and this was in 1860, oh, oopsie. Nope. No, wrong way. This was in 1861. One of the most tragic stories of the story is about Charles Incramamani, who was a native Bolivian gentleman who really had expert knowledge about which trees were the most valuable. He'd been asked by Charles Ledger to collect some seeds because he heard that the British government wanted seeds for plantation, and unfortunately he was killed for his part in the process. These seeds that he collected, the Cinchona calisea, really truly proved to have a really high amounts of quinine, about 11% compared to the British species, which had about 5%. And from these seeds, the Dutch went on to lead the global trade in quinine. This is opposed to the British plantations, which were aimed at providing quinine and different alkaloids for treating malaria in-house almost for workers and people in the army. This is a picture of a British plantation. You can see they've slashed and burned the local area and planted straight lines of cinchona, and they all look very proud of themselves there. And that what they were doing is producing small single-dose sachets at a very cheap rate for provision at post offices throughout India. Whether or not that was entirely successful is more complex. Of course, all of this work in India and with the Dutch Indonesia had really significant impacts on local environment and local workforces, and it's something to think about when we look into the history of cinchona. So the role of quinine today. Quinine is still in use. During the Second World War, the main producer of quinine was in Dutch Indonesia, but with the invasion of the Japanese in 1941, I can't remember the date, cut off the supplies of cinchona bark to provide quinine to the Allies. And at that point, the Americans desperately sought around for alternatives, going to South America to try and find trees, but there wasn't very many. But it also meant that the synthetics were invented. So synthetic antimalarials were invented at that point. Not synthetic quinine, but a synthetic antimalarial. And that was used from that point on. But with, so quinine continued to be used in cases of drug-resistant malaria and is also used today by high-performance athletes and long-distance runners who swear it really helps with leg cramps. But unfortunately, long-term use can affect the heart, so it's not recommended by doctors. This is also to be kept in mind with drinking too much tonic water, particularly in the recent years as people are more interested in making their own tonic water, that there is a fine line between cure and poison. If you have too much quinine, it is toxic, and you can give yourself something called synchronism, which starts off with ringing in the ears, can lead to impaired vision, abdominal cramps, dizziness, and nausea. So if you think you're drinking too much tonic water and your ears are ringing, you probably are. But the plants are not entirely out of the story, because our main drug for malaria in the world today comes from Artemisia annua, which is Chinese sweet wormwood. And another chemical that's taken out of that is artemisinin, discovered in an ancient Chinese herbal by Tu Yu in the 60s, just as synthetic antimalarials started to become significantly resistant. And she won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2015, because malaria is still a massive killer today. So on to the bit we've been waiting for, which is about how did quinine and alcohol get paired? And it is a very complex story, not as easy as the myth that Mark talked about at the beginning of the talk. But one thing for sure is that quinine and alcohol do have an affinity. They're a perfect pairing because alcohol helps quinine alkaloids dissolve better than if you were to put it in water. They're not water-soluble. And of course, unlike Mary Poppins saying, a teaspoon of sugar makes the medicine go down, a teaspoon of alcohol helps the medicine go down. So here's some examples of throughout the 18th and 19th century, well, from the discovery of cinchona bark, putting it powdered bark in wine was a really popular way of taking the medicine. But throughout the 18th and 19th century, throughout the 19th century, alcoholic extracts of quinine were really popular. This lovely sounding orange quinine wine was very popular in Britain. It wasn't really a wine, it was more like an orange spirits with quinine in, but I bet it tastes lovely. I'd love somebody to make that again. And then other ones include things like Quina Rossi and San Rafael. Some people might recognize those names. They're very popular in the continent. They still exist today. And Dubonnet, which is with quinine as well. These are bitter pre-dinner aperitifs. The thing about quinine is it is bitter. And one of the important things to know is that throughout the 18th and 19th century, bitters were considered digestives and something that improved digestion. Quinine was also considered a tonic, so not just an anti-malarial, but a bit of a wonder drug that was assigned as a tonic, which is an important category of medicine that helped the resilience of the body and helped make you feel better as well. So these tonics would be taken before dinner because of the digestive and the tonic properties, and also is where you get your pre-dinner gin and tonic. That's where it's kind of come from, but we don't really remember that anymore. But technically it's a medicine, so it's okay. So from this kind of period, medicinally, alcohol was also continued to be used in the army for taking quinine doses after William Balfour Beatty. But interestingly, we can't find very many references to gin. Mainly they come down to rum and whiskey, particularly rum in the Navy. And for soldiers in British India, you're more likely to get it given to you in arrack, which is a locally distilled sugarcane spirit, and which was cheap and locally available. And so actually many references in the army to their daily dose was to be tempting the soldiers was to put it in arrack rather than gin. So how does it get paired with gin? I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit about the history of gin, because it's a botanical history about gin and tonic rather than just tonic. So the origin of English gin was Dutch gin. Its origins lie in the medieval Low Countries, where Geneva is its original name, came from the word for juniper berry, which is the defining ingredient in gin, as quinine is of tonic water. Starting off as a flavoured brandy distilled from wine with juniper berries, from the 16th century it became based on the grain alcohol that we know today. Now, British soldiers first met this in the 30 Years' War, around 1618, where they took it to drunk it for a bit of Dutch courage, which is where that term comes from. It was then drunk in huge quantities throughout the 18th century. Statistics, some research has shown that for a person, an average adult in London, you drink 63 litres of gin per year, which led to the Great Gin Panic. I'm not surprised. And then, again, a resurgence with the 19th century gin palaces. Now, the two important things I'd like you to remember is, from this point, the most popular way to take gins were in gin and bitters, which was having a gin with a bitter flavouring. They just go very well together. And the other is a gin sling. Gin with sugar, citrus, and soda water. Basically, a gin and tonic with everything in it apart from the quinine. Where did this sparkling water come from, though? Because we've seen how gin comes to be. What we want to know about is a bit about the sparkling water that makes up the base of the tonic water. So its early history is bound up with long-standing ideas that water brings health. So if you think about throughout ancient Egypt and Greece and the Romans, having spas and baths to bring greater health has been a very important idea and still exists today. But it was a discovery by Joseph Priestley in the 1760s that he could infuse carbon dioxide arising off beer vats into water that gave it a fizzy flavour, and replicated some of the mineral waters that had a slightly effervescent health-giving property, which is why he was interested in recreating it. So the popularity of sparkling water spread very fast, and by the late 18th century and 19th century, you get in many newspapers and medical journals adverts for soda waters and sparkling waters all over, and machinery to make it yourself. And Schweppes, Jacob Schweppes, who probably everybody here will recognise the name of, really popularised the manufacturing process, which led to this machinery. And he also was the official provider of mineral waters to the Great Exhibition in 1851, where he created, well, not him because he was dead by then, but the company created a giant pink glass fountain made out of 4 tons of glass. And this fountain is now adopted. It caused such a sensation. It became the logo that you find on the side of all Schweppes bottles today, and Schweppes logos. So how did, finally, the quinine come to the soda water or the sparkling water? What's really important to acknowledge here is mine and Mark's job has been made so much easier with the great amount of works that have been digitised in the last decade or so, without which you'd have to go by hand through things, but also the character recognition, being able to search through newspaper archives online to find lots and lots of references, and like kind of thinking laterally about how people might have talked about tonic water before it came tonic water. So one thing we did discover was this article, this advert here from the Bristol Mercury in 1835, which we think so far is the one we know is the earliest reference to something that was basically a tonic water. And it's called Hughes Quinine Soda Water. And they're the sole inventors, apparently, of the quinine soda water, to which the attention of physicians and surgeons is particularly invited. Now, if you do know a bit of tonic water history, you will know about the name Erasmus Bond, and he's the one that is most commonly talked about, and that's because he's the first person to patent a tonic water, and he gave it the name tonic water, which is how we know the name today. And this is his patent of 1858, number 1207, for an improved aerated liquid, which included quinine, water, salicine, which is a glucoside related to aspirin, and sulfuric acid. It's probably a bit harder on the stomach than we'd imagine today. And this is an advert for his tonic water. It was called Pitt's Aerated Tonic Water. And what's really important to note here is, unlike many of the origin stories of the gin and tonic, which is about it being for malaria, is that neither Hughes and Company nor Erasmus Bond talk about malaria. Instead, they talk about imparting strength to those who suffer from nervous irritation, indigestion, and loss of appetite, and for debility of the stomach. So there's that bitter and that tonic theme coming through, and this is the origin of the first tonic waters, was for this purpose. So it's restorative, and the clue's in the name, tonic water. So our scene is now going to shift eastwards to India, where tonic water becomes very popular as a refreshing drink. Now, in much of the medical texts of the time, if you're a traveller to India or tropical areas, what you took to drink or eat was recommended as very important, because the European body needs to acclimatise to the environment. And refreshing light drinks, such as soda water and tonic waters, were very much recommended. Through searches, not just by us, but by others, including Camper English, who Mark mentioned the other tonic water book before, and other mixologists, this is the earliest known reference to gin and tonic. It's in the setting of a race course in India, in Lucknow, and it sounds like a bit of a rowdy party, so there's plenty of betting going on, and loud cries of gin and tonic, brandy and soda, charutes, told us the party was breaking up for the night, and we wended our way home. So it's clear that it was kind of a term that's in common use. So perhaps somebody somewhere in an attic will find a diary about somebody that says, oh, we've discovered this gin and tonic a bit earlier than this date in 1868. But considering 1858 was the invention of tonic water, and we know by the early 1600s that tonic water comes over to India, it's not very much leeway for changing anything much earlier than 1868, so we think it's a good indicator of the time that the gin and tonic came about. And then from this point, you start finding more and more references in the literature. I've just got a couple here. There are more in the book, but there's an amusing scene from a book called 20 Years Pig Sticking in Bengal from 1879, where a judge who preferred to imbibe on horseback got a glass of gin and tonic, and a twinkle in his eyes showed he was going to enjoy it. So again, all these references are about leisure rather than medicine. They're often associated with things like racing, hunting, and the leisure classes, or in the downtime, which is an important thing to talk about rather than it being an anti-malarial cocktail. So when does it come to the UK? We do know when it doesn't come to the UK, because in 1881, which is a good 20 years after it, a disgruntled writer writes to the Sporting Times in London saying, "Dear sir, why in the name of all that is mysterious is tonic water not procurable in England, the land that boasts almost every kind of mineral water? I've passed a good portion of my life in the land of India and have now just returned after a 6 years' sojourn in that country. India has its blessings as well as its reverse of blessings, but one of its greatest enjoyments is the pleasant peg. We have our brandies and sodas and other drinks procurable in this delightful country of England, but we fail to find here the drink most patronised in India, the gin and tonic. Of course, a gin is to be had, but where the tonic?" And he goes on to ask people to write to him if he knows where they can get some. So we know it's not here and not popular in England by this time. Then the next references that we do have in Britain for gin and tonic comes in 1920, so a good 40 years. And this is because in the newspapers, you start to see many, many references to people being arrested for drink driving after a gin and tonic. Now, we don't know if that's because of the real popularisation of the motor car, if it's because that's when the gin and tonic's coming across, or if it's because of a clampdown on laws. But we do know it's between 1881 and 1920 that it does start to appear. So we finally established that it was popular by the 1920s, but an interesting story about its interruption comes from World War II, because of the quinine supplies that were cut off, as I mentioned before, from the Japanese invasion of Dutch Indonesia. Also meant that people couldn't get their tonic water because any leftover supplies were sequestered for the war effort, understandably. If this hadn't happened, who knows what the history would have been like for the gin and tonic. This is a picture of just down the road in Piccadilly Circus. This is a boarded up Eros statue. And just above it, you can see a Schweppes tonic water sign. That stayed there for the duration of the war, but they were switched off lights. And also you can just see the fountain based on that 1851 Great Exhibition, the Schweppes logo. So it's just an interesting story, that one. So in the case of North America, it became very, very popular from the 1950s and 60s and a resurgence after the war about gin and tonic, which really established this idea of it being associated with a suave gentleman of taste. But then we did have a bit of a decline from the 1970s onwards, and this is an interesting picture from 1996 by Peter Brook, which combines several stereotypes of a golf-playing smooth businessman, or perhaps in this case, a down-falling Tory MP, who might have been drinking a G&T based on Hogarth's Gin Lane. So it became very much out of fashion. But it's okay, because it had a revival from 1988 with the creation of Bombay Sapphire, which really was the first forerunner of the artisanal gins. And then later in Britain, just slightly later, with Sipsmith, who set up a distillery located just by Kew Gardens. Interestingly, they had a bit of a battle with Her Majesty's Revenue to receive a license to distill because the concept of small-scale production fell foul of 18th century laws aimed at banning production of moonshine. But eventually we had gin, and very, very quickly in the wake of artisanal gin became artisanal tonic waters, popularised particularly by Fever Tree, launching in 2005, and then followed by other brands. In 2018, tonic water sales were an astonishing £687 million, a third more than 2017. And 3/4 of gin is drunk with tonic. While it's not clear if this growth rate continued, tonic water is clearly here to stay. And in the book, we do talk about, in the last chapter, we have a load of recipes showing that tonic water doesn't have to be paired with gin, but it goes very well with other things, particularly whiskey, rum, and my favourite, wine. Honestly, it is really nice. I've had to convince a lot of people, but it's very nice chilled wine and chilled rum. So we hope you've enjoyed this very quick gallop through the history of botany, plants, empire, and the gin and tonic, and there's lots more info that we couldn't just go into, but it is all in this book. So if you'd like to join us later, if you haven't got your Christmas present already, we are selling upstairs at a brilliant discount of £12 instead of £19. It's cheaper than Amazon. So you can ask us to sign it if you'd like. And we'd love for you to ask us some questions right now, but afterwards we're going to hope you can join us for a couple of small gin and tonics upstairs. We've got two versions. raced around Q gin.
Next slide.
Oh, sorry. Next slide.
Next slide.
Next
okay.
slide. Yes, sorry. Got distracted by the idea of gin and tonic. Really would like one. Yeah, we've got Q gin here, which has got 24 botanicals in it. Some of them which are foraged from Kew Gardens. Doesn't contain passion flower, just that's a nice picture. And we paired it with Bermondsey Tonic, which is the one Mark showed you with the lovely amber colour, or rusted he called it, which is made with cinchona bark, so you can try that gin and tonic with a early version of cinchona bark. And then later on, the second, if you keep your glass with you, you can have a second one with Kew's own tonic water that they brought out. It's just been made for where has it been made for, Mark?
The Asian market.
The Asian market, there you go. It's made in New Zealand with Javanese quinine, and it's got a grapefruit and elderflower flavour. So, did I forget anything?
No,
there you go. Thank you very much.